everyone, and welcome back to the Context Studio. I am so happy to be back with another episode of our banned book club series where we read like freedom depends on it. In this series, we explore books that have been challenged in schools and libraries across the US, many of which dare readers to critically think about power, control, and human rights and connect those themes to both historical and contemporary issues. This time, I am so pleased to be in conversation with a public historian and author, Paola Alonso Guerrero, to discuss the historical discrimination that women of color have faced in the US, specifically related to reproductive control, as we witnessed in last month's read, A Handmaid's Tale. While A Handmaid's Tale presents a fictional society, many of its themes, particularly around reproductive control and restriction of autonomy, are grounded in real policies and lived experience. For this episode, we'll be looking at the other end of the spectrum and learning about eugenics and the forced sterilization by deep diving into Paola's article, Autonomy Revoked, the forced sterilization of women of color in the 20th century. This is an article that sheds light on the not-so-distant past of human rights violations related to women's bodily autonomy today, specifically for women of color. And through Paola's article and our discussion, we're going to uncover a history that is both unsettling and also essential to understand and protect our future for women and girls all around the world. So we're going to explore how these systems are operated, how these patterns can be repeated, and why it's so important to understand this history today. So without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce Paola. Thank you so much for being here. Paola, thank you so much for being here today. I'm super happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for reaching out to me. Let me tell you, I was a little surprised, but the premise of your book club sounded so fun and so interesting. I don't know, scholars just really like to talk with each other, so I'm really have been looking forward to this.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, when I came across your article, I was like, I need to speak to the author of this. I need to kind of understand what went into you writing this. So I'm super happy and excited that you were interested and up for it. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work with the Irving Archives in Texas, any other work that you're doing, and kind of what you're doing in that role in the day-to-day?
Yeah, sure. So I was the archives coordinator for Irving Archives and Museum. I'm transitioning to be the assistant curator of history at the Albuquerque Museum. So I'm moving from Texas to New Mexico, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But I am a public historian by trade. I got my bachelor's degree in history in 2020, and then I got my master's degree also in history, but with public history as a focus this past December. So
Congratulations.
th Thank you. And so this was just a long journey of me learning about how to best take what I've learned in the classroom and make it as easily accessible to people in every way possible. So that's kind of what led me to write that article that we're mentioning here. So,
Yeah.
um, Autonomy Revoked, the forced sterilization of women of color in 20th century America. Thank you. Yes. What's interesting about that is I published it for my school's history student journal.
hmm
And I did it just because, this happened in 2020. This was COVID. I had finished everything that I needed to for my other classes. I didn't have a lot else to do, and I was going to transition into grad school. And I knew that publishing my work was a good step to get ready for grad school.
hmm
So I worked with a professor and a couple of other colleagues to edit papers, and then I submitted this one. This had been a rework of a paper that I had done for a class. It was on contraception during the Victorian era. But as I was researching, I found that I really wanted to focus on women of color and immigrants. That's really where my interests historically really lie, is in women's history. As I kept researching, I kept seeing information about forced sterilization, and this is something that I had also heard about in my classes and discussions in the past. And that's what led my paper to being fully about that thesis, about the forced sterilization of women of color, specifically in the 20th century in the United States, because a lot of people like to think that these things in history happened a long time ago. But honestly, things that happened even 100 years ago are still deeply impacting us today, nowadays. And it really sets the foundation for a lot of our politics, the things going on sociologically. That's why I keep focusing on that.
Oh, of course, of course. And I totally understand what you mean. And I think it's interesting, reading even The Handmaid's Tale, reading that you look at how autonomy is revoked and kind of completely the other end of it, but it's all related to that same concept of the
Mhm.
patriarchy, the government controlling women's rights to their own bodies, giving birth, not giving birth. And it's interesting, you touch on this a little bit in the article as well about the differences that different women of different races have in experiencing sterilization process. Certain women
Mhm.
were actually refused that service or were told that there was a really, really long waiting period, while other women, obviously, it was done without their consent, without their knowledge. So that kind of juxtaposition of it is just completely insane to me. And I think it's really interesting as well, kind of you talking about how you got through that process and what made you interested in this. And I guess as well, just on my end, relating to the history. So my boyfriend, he is a nurse. He's studied healthcare his whole life. So he's very aware and has a lot of knowledge about the gendered aspects of the healthcare system, as well as the racialized aspects of the healthcare system and the inequity that is there. So I did have some knowledge about this, I would say, going into the book, going into even my relationship with him, but I've definitely learned a lot since we've gotten together and he's shared a lot of insight with that on me, and it's just quite appalling. And I mean, even reading
Yeah.
your article, there were new aspects that I learned from your article as well. So it was
Mhm.
definitely a very, very thought-provoking piece.
I think it's so interesting that you bring up your boyfriend being a nurse because I think that's also what shaped this article is I went into school to become a labor and delivery nurse at first, and
Really?
then I didn't do so well in my anatomy and physiology classes, and so that's why I pivoted to history. But I mean, there was a part of me that was so interested in medicine and anatomy and the way the human body works, and so this paper was not only a culmination of my love for women's history, but also a little bit of that interest in medical history as well.
Oh, totally. And I think kind of as well talking about it in the contemporary and modern context, I think people with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, I think people really feel like this is an issue of now, things that people have never kind of dealt with before. But, Roe versus Wade only came into existence in the late 60s, and some of the research I've done in the California prisons in 2000, I think it was 2006 to 2011, which we can get into a little bit later. I mean,
Mhm.
these are very, very real modern examples. And just as you said, this history is not so far in the past. It's a lot to unpack, and I think a lot of people, I would imagine, feel it's easier to just turn the other way and pretend that this is like a recent issue rather than understand that this is something that specific communities have been dealing with historically for a really, really long time. Going into autonomy revoked, when we talk about bodily autonomy in a historical or even contemporary context, what did that actually mean for people whose choices were restricted or overridden? What does that actually look like?
Yeah, when I look into history, I did a little bit of research into contraception in the Victorian era. And throughout all points of history, women were always trying to control when they gave birth the best that they could. Sometimes we get that stereotype of women being very innocent, very naive, and that is true, I think, especially with the upper classes in regards to women. However, women have always been in tune with their body. They've always known how their body functions and they've known how to take that autonomy into their own hands. So, for example, indigenous women would brew teas that were abortifacients that would help them clear out their uterine lining. And I think what bodily autonomy means to me in a historical and contemporary context is being fully informed about what's going on with your body, and then making the decision that you think is best for your own body. And I think throughout history, women have had such a lack of education, and this has been on purpose. And that's why Margaret Sanger was so interesting to research. Because she was, and I'm not saying that she was racist. That was one thing that happened after I published my paper. Somebody took my paper and they were like, Margaret Sanger's a racist. And I was like, that's not what I said.
No, out of context. Wait, hold up.
Super out of context.
Yeah.
But it was very much of the time that these people, they were called the progressives, but it was something that happened throughout history. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, people were doing what they could to try to improve their society in whatever way they understood best. And Margaret Sanger, for example, saw that there was this miseducation of women in regards to their own bodies. So she produced this pamphlet that would educate women on their bodily functions that got her in a lot of trouble. I think what happened afterwards was she got fined or arrested for mailing out obscene materials.
Oh,
Um, yes, and so that is a law that really affected Planned Parenthood in its early days. But these people adopted eugenics as a way to improve their society. And when we talk about that word eugenics, there's two things in there. So the prefix EU means good and genics means genetics.
right.
So this could be a lot of things. And in theory, what it boils down to is doing what you can with the current generation to improve the next one.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, a lot of the people that believed in it were very white supremacist and anti-poverty, anti-immigrant, anti a lot of the things that, go
Right.
against go against everything that I write about in my paper. And so a lot of the times what they would consider to be this filth on society were these immigrant groups, these people living in poverty, people who were incarcerated, people who were disabled, and they would weaponize medicine to improve the next generation.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I found that really interesting because I mean, I am a huge supporter and fan of Planned Parenthood, to be honest. Like, I think that
Mhm.
they're doing really, really great work. I mean, I'm sure that you would agree with that. I think most people that have
Yeah.
perspectives would agree with that. But it's always interesting when you look back at the history that kind of formed these organizations. It's the same way I used to work with a refugee resettlement organization that was founded by Albert Einstein, and it was created kind of after the Holocaust to support Jewish refugees. And with that came a lot of Zionist kind of undertones that I was not necessarily privy to. And they do great work now, and they were
Mhm.
doing great work then and found a need. But some of the other voices that came along with that definitely were questionable, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinions. And I think the same could be definitely said about Margaret Sanger. I mean, I found through your article the Malthusians.
Malthusian, yeah.
It's like tongue twister. I've tried to practice it a couple times to pronounce that right, but the group that focused on the idea that poverty resulted in excess population and they kind of advocated for contraceptions through that. I mean, that's such a it's such a nuanced conversation and a nuanced opinion that when you just look at that, you think, oh my gosh, this is a horrible position. And in so many ways it is when you
Mhm.
bring so many of the other aspects to that kind of conversation. When we talk kind of, so we're talking about the individuals at the level. When we talk about the institutions that played a role in justifying control over women's bodies, kind of which would you say those were? Which institutions do you think had the most power? Do you think it was the social society, maybe the legal, medical, government?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a mixture of all three of those. So, in my article, I write about how really what started medical sterilization against people happened in a prison. And I think that is something that is really profound to be able to acknowledge is when people become prisoners, they have abandoned or they're forced to abandon everything about themselves that makes them individuals and makes them human. And I know we live in a very carceral nation here in the United States, and I know that this is a very complicated topic. But a lot of the people who were being incarcerated then and even now are, the same people that were being targeted for sterilization. So poor people, people of color, immigrants. That was really where eugenics and forced sterilization started. And then afterwards, there was legal protection against sterilization in the courts and even in the federal government. Forced sterilization against disabled people was the next step. And I think that is so interesting because nowadays we are a little bit more connected. And I want to bring up what happened with Britney Spears and her conservatorship, because that was a big thing that really made people understand how mentally ill people and disabled people are taken advantage of by their family members and by the legal system as well. And that really made me wonder, like, if this really, you know, powerful, very well-known woman is able to go through this thing that stripped her of all of her legal rights, what hope does anybody who is in any sort of a vulnerable position, what
Right.
can they do?
Totally, totally. A little background about me. So I work in anti-trafficking. So I think a lot about and study and work a lot in the sphere of exploitation and what is exploitation. And I think people that, whether you're in the prison system, whether you're suffering from mental illness, disability, I mean, even being a woman to some extent, you are inherent woman of color on top of that. You're inherently more vulnerable to the different elements of the state that are kind of coming in to take over your position and to dictate what things should be, what things shouldn't be. And so when I look at situations like Britney Spears or even people that went to their doctors in good faith, and in your article, you mentioned the 12-year-old that was sterilized and her mother thought was illiterate and thought that she was signing paperwork for her to get a medical shot. That's insane to me, and it all kind of feeds back to this overall picture I have of exploitation and how even the state, they're willing to allow exploitation or even I would argue facilitate exploitation, but it leads to this end goal of what they view society as being able to. And the medical practitioners, the legal system, all of that are just kind of facilitators of this overall exploitation that happens from that higher picture and that higher power.
That really makes me think how some people really consider the government to be kind of like this unknowable entity. And in my research, I've really noticed that it is the individuals who are working for the government and their beliefs that have really driven a lot of these laws that we would consider to be, racist and white supremacist and all of these things. And it's important to be able to acknowledge that the government is not perfect, to say the least. And it is very easily influenced by those who are in power, who are politicians.
Oh, I'm totally with you. And I mean, I think even with things like Roe versus Wade being
Mhm,
overturned, at least I felt in this society and I'm also from Seattle. So
mhm,
putting that into context, it's a very liberal bubble, a very liberal state, and a very liberal area, at least the Seattle metropolitan area is. So in our state, abortion rights like Roe v. Wade, those are in the state's constitution, so they cannot be overturned. But when it
mhm.
comes to the federal context of it, that's why there's so much discrepancy and inequity in different states and where different people are. And I think that's part of what creates so much fear is everything is so out of the individual's control. And you have to just trust your state politicians to advocate for you. But when you're in a state and you're in a space where people are not aligned on your value,
Mhm.
you don't necessarily have that much of a say in it. And you realize, I think, how little control you have over it.
Yeah.
So, do you feel like current fears about losing control over someone's body is grounded in patterns we've already seen? In the modern context, do you feel like these concerns about forced sterilization in the past are relevant today?
Yeah, I think that, where there's smoke, there's fire. And unfortunately, when I published my paper, I just expected it to go off into this corner of the internet and not be acknowledged, as happens with a lot of scholars. But unfortunately, after I published it, news came out that women in a Georgia detention center were being forcibly sterilized. And that is what brought my paper out into be cited and be acknowledged. I think it's because of its, the fact that it's public and it's got all the keywords in there that people were looking for. But, that was just, I guess, right place at the right time, but like in the worst possible way. And in 2020, it's just so interesting because that was 6 years ago. And, you think about detention centers are just an extension of our carceral systems, of our prisons, and these women are fully dependent on um, law enforcement and the people working at the detention centers to have their quality of life in mind. And as we've seen over and over again, they're being sterilized. They don't have access to clean water. Not even immigrant children who are being detained are being properly cared for. So I think that we are unfortunately in a place in our current history where the fact that we have this carceral system, the fact that we don't have these legal protections like Roe v. Wade anymore, puts us in a pretty sticky situation in regards to women's reproductive rights and anybody's reproductive rights, really. And if I could get like a little personal for a minute, living in Texas was, when all of the news about Roe v. Wade coming out, that made me personally very scared. I am married, so me and my husband had been having this decades long conversation about whether we wanted to have kids, when would be the right time to do so. When the news that Roe v. Wade was coming out, I started looking into more long-term methods of birth control because I didn't know if I was going to have access to my birth control pills anymore because we had no idea what was going to happen with the government. That led us to in 2024, after Donald Trump got elected again, my husband and I decided that it would be best for one of us to seek sterilization in order to be able to, not be able to go back on that decision. We didn't want to depend too much on temporary birth control like IUDs or anything like that.
Right.
And so my husband got a vasectomy, and, that was us taking that decision into our own hands because we had no idea what the political landscape was going to look like in the future. I love children very much. I think, children are wonderful. However, I think that I would prefer not having children than to bring children into a political landscape that I'm not familiar with. And also, the maternal mortality rate in Texas is extremely high, especially if you are a woman of color, and particularly Black women as well. So even if I did decide to have children, I knew that that would be a huge risk to not only myself, but to my family as well. And so millions of people are having these conversations every day in this state and other red states as well. And even if you live in a blue state, things are really scary still because you don't know what's going to happen federally.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm so sorry that that was the position that you, along with everybody else, I mean, as we all are put in.
Mhm,
I can say only just from my own friends and family's experiences that a lot of them, one, were able to seek abortions before this Roe v. Wade was overturned. They were able to
mhm,
seek it, and they were able to then go on to have kids later when they were able to make the decision to have more stability in their life too. And so those procedures actually added benefit to their life in ways and protected their future and protected the future of their kids. I also know people in this post Roe v. Wade era that were actually based in Texas and had to fly out of state to get these
mhm,
procedures done and then come back into state. And there's so many complexities that come with that, in the legal system and the court system. And even thinking about Tennessee trying to pass life in prison for women that get abortions because they call it pre-child murder. Like it's
mhm,
insane, like the way that different governments and different state governments are able to kind of twist this narrative and, really put the blame on the women and the families that are put in this position, I think is there's very few words I can think of honestly to describe it except for just horrible and disgusting. And
right.
I feel so much empathy to everybody who is in a state where it's being completely just revoked and overturned. And it, like I said, in Seattle, things are scary in different ways, and you don't really know what's going to come. But at least there is some level of protection being in a blue state. When you were talking about Georgia, it made me think on kind of on the inverse of the forced sterilization was Andriana Smith. forced to stay on life support even though she was brain dead because they could not perform the procedure, and she
Mhm.
was forced to give birth to the child before taken off of life support. I mean, talk about inhumane. It's just appalling to think that that's really the situation that we're in. And it feels, I mean, connecting it back to The Handmaid's Tale, it feels so dystopian in that sense. And
Mhm.
I keep in mind that The Handmaid's Tale was written in 1985 about a dystopian future in the US. And, I mean, it doesn't, to be honest, it doesn't really feel like sometimes we're that far off from that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. My heart really goes out for Adriana Smith and her family because time and time again, legislators have proven that they do not understand or perhaps don't have empathy towards people who are able to get pregnant, and they just fully do not comprehend the ability to do so. I know Ted Cruz, I think at one point, was saying that ectopic pregnancies could be extracted and then implanted in the uterus, which is just not medically possible. And so everything going on, I think, is also so dystopian because it just belittles women as incubators, and as nothing else. And I think, as you were mentioning, Adriana Smith, yes, the Handmaid's Tale does come to mind because that is essentially what a lot of these women were boiled down to is incubators and I guess a means to an end, unfortunately, and not as individuals.
Oh, totally, totally. And I guess we're talking like specifically and broadly, but I know in your article you mentioned something, a case Bell versus Buck. Would you mind
Mhm.
going into Bell versus Buck a little bit?
Yes, so I Buck versus Bell was specifically the Supreme Court case that confirmed the constitutionality of forced sterilization. And there was this quote that I remember seeing, which was like, it called disabled people feeble-minded, which I guess is not a term that we use very much nowadays, but it essentially reduced the humanity of disabled people to be able to make their own decisions over their own body. And at the very least, codified the fact that it was legal to be able to forcibly sterilize disabled people, which is, again, a very slippery slope because most of us able-bodied people are only one accident away from becoming disabled. Or, the term disabled is so subjective. What does that mean to someone? And so unfortunately, whenever, the most vulnerable people are being attacked, that unfortunately creates a slippery slope for other populations to be attacked as well.
I mean, unfortunately, that makes sense. And interesting while you were describing that, it made me think of, the Salem witch trials, which in The Handmaid's Tale, a lot of the clothing and stuff was based in the Puritan England culture. I mean, and I'm sure that back then they did not have much access or support for reproductive health care. Women's rights were definitely pushed to the side. And but like with this things like the Salem witch trials, they just decided, oh, this woman is a witch because of this, this, and this. And they were able
Mhm.
then to make huge decisions, fatal repercussions on these women and these people for that. I mean, there was no real basis for that. And looking at that in a real practical example of people that struggle with disabilities, it's just crazy how history kind of is cyclical.
Yes, definitely history is very cyclical. One of my professors commented on the term history repeats itself. And everybody disagreed on that. And it's history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Society changes, but a lot of these things are very cyclical. So again, the carceral system, um, discrimination against disabled people. You see this happening a lot nowadays, unfortunately. It's the state believing that they have autonomy over an individual's body and forcing them to be able to do something against their will, which has happened with Adriana Smith. And it happened with, unfortunately, a lot of women living in red states who had a planned pregnancy and then they found out that it was either going to threaten their own lives or the child was not going to live a quality of life and was not going to be able to live a very long life at all. These women are not able to make these decisions that are best for them or their own family. And yeah, I really think about that discrepancy that I mentioned where women of color were almost being ushered into getting sterilized, and white women were being stopped from getting sterilized. And nowadays, I've had a friend who actually has been sterilized themselves, and they do make you wait, I believe, 72 hours before, your initial appointment and then going through with the procedure. And while I do think that sterilization for young childless people is difficult if inaccessible to get, I think whatever you want to do with your body, you should be able to do.
Right.
Um, I understand that those precautions were put in place because of all of these women of color that were forcibly sterilized. And that specifically came after Madrigal versus Killigan,
Yeah.
which were in the 60s, Mexican and Hispanic women who were being in mass forcibly sterilized. Someone like myself who does decide to sterilize myself, exerting my own autonomy over my own body, it kind of makes me put myself in the position of what those women were going through. And unfortunately, even though I can decide to make this decision for myself, these women were not allowed to.
And I was just reading kind of the example you brought up, and I mean one of the women says that as she was sitting there in pain, she was told by one of the women in Spanish, "You better sign these papers or your baby is going to die." I mean, talk about coercion, talk about exploitation, and also a woman giving birth, that is such a vulnerable position to be in.
Mhm.
You're taking somebody in a position where they're in so much physical pain, they're in so much mental agony, there's so many mixed feelings and emotions going on at that time, and then you threaten them. I mean, what do you expect is going to happen? And that's, again, it's an example of these systems, these institutions, the state kind of totally exploiting that position and taking control of vulnerable people. It's just appalling. But kind of shifting it back to eugenics a little bit. So you define eugenics in your article as the belief that certain practices could improve the biology and genetics of the human race, with white, able-bodied people being concerned or considered the most fit representation of good genetics. And you also
Mhm.
mentioned the racist beliefs that led to the involuntary sterilization of women of color.
Mhm.
How did the eugenics movement frame reproductive control as something beneficial or even necessary for society today?
A lot of eugenicists, first of all, they were able to become very credible. This belief was able to become very credible because a lot of politicians and scientists and very elite members of society were the ones who did believe in eugenics. In the 1910s and 1920s, you got this influx of immigrants over from Europe and other countries. And so unfortunately, a lot of this, it represents the politics of the time. And a lot of that was the xenophobia against these immigrant groups that were first coming in. For example, nowadays, whenever the topic of immigration gets brought up, a lot of US citizens get really nervous because they believe that, someone is coming for their resources and their jobs and like all of these other things. And that was what a lot of people who didn't have as high of an education back then, that was what they believed. They were being put against this new wave of immigrant groups. And so these elite people who did believe in eugenics, they believed that being able to control the people who they considered to be not the highest in society, as I mentioned, immigrants, poor people, disabled people,
Right.
that being able to prevent them from giving birth and creating the next generation was going to be improving their society because then white people and people who are affluent and people who are able-bodied could then also have kids and replace that population. So yeah, it's this big, huge replacement theory.
I mean, do you see these aspects as efforts to control individuals, shape the broader population? How do you see this playing in women having no bodily autonomy and the state controlling the bodily autonomy of women?
I think definitely there is ulterior motives and other agendas at play when we talk about these laws. A lot of these laws that get passed nowadays are under the guise of protecting women, protecting children, protecting the status quo or whatever. But a lot of the ulterior motives back then and now were to allow these white Anglo-Saxon populations to be able to procreate, to give them the benefit of doing so, and to hinder immigrants and people of color from being able to have children.
Mhm.
And so I think that is twofold in encouraging, I guess, the right population to have children and discourage the wrong population to have children. As I mentioned, that discrepancy between white women and women of color getting sterilized, there was also that discrepancy. So white women were encouraged to have children, and women of color were discouraged to have children. And that's where the forcible sterilization comes in.
Definitely. And kind of looking at the medical systems that were doing this. So obviously there were elements of coercion, elements
Mhm.
and spaces where there was completely misinformed consent. I mean, how do these different aspects about coercion and lack of informed consent reveal who holds power and who doesn't within the medical system? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
When doing this paper, it really made me put myself in the perspective of these women. And who amongst us has not gone to a doctor, known something was wrong with us, and then be dismissed by that doctor and say, well, I guess it was all in my head. Because
Totally.
you are taught to, respect them as authority figures. They are the ones that went through this training and did all that. And I think you should respect doctors. I don't disagree with that. But doctors and medical professionals are also individuals with their own beliefs. And whether consciously or subconsciously, they do allow these beliefs to enter their when they are at work as well. And so we all have some level of bias and some stuff that we need to unlearn. Those of us living in the United States, I can't speak for anybody else, but yeah, definitely we all have biases that we need to unlearn. Medical professionals are not above that. And it really makes me think about these women who had no education, who didn't have very many resources. Even the women in Madrigal versus Killigan, it was just a matter of someone not being able to speak Spanish, someone not being able to speak their language at the places that cost them this informed consent. And so, whenever you're really able to learn about your body, to learn about what is able to do, and to have the confidence even to speak one-on-one with these medical professionals about what's going on with your own body, I think that that's when you're truly able to get this informed consent.
And how do you think individual stories frame the importance of this, in terms of understanding history, especially with the policies? And a doctor or a nurse or someone can be well-intentioned, but they have their own biases. So there's kind of an abstract nature of this. How do you really get to the root of this problem, and how do the individual stories help get us there?
Yes, I really wanted to highlight the individual stories in this paper because that was something that I wasn't seeing in my history classes whenever I would read about women of color and women and all of these other marginalized groups. And these stories are so powerful. Even if it happened to just one woman, it's still something significant and it's still something that we should all be working towards. Preventing from happening again. But the fact that it happened to all of these women, and I'm really glad that we are able to have these recollections from their own perspective. I think I have Fannie Lou Hamer in there. She was sterilized in Mississippi. She was the one that came up with the term Mississippi appendectomy
Mhm.
in regards to Black women being sterilized. The fact that we have these recollections is so important because it is so important to be able to acknowledge in these women's own words what happened, be able to validate it, and acknowledge that it happened, and do our best to be able to prevent that from happening again. A lot of times in history classes, you see a lot of statistics and you see a lot of general statements, but you can't connect with them. And it's whenever you're able to see the names of the people that were impacted and their own stories, when you really are able to get down to the empathy and the human aspect of history.
Oh, totally. Speaking on that human aspect, how these stories and this lack of control really echoes over the generations within these communities.
I think the thing that really broke my heart when writing this paper was when I was writing specifically on Native American women. And that is so heartbreaking because being Indigenous in the United States is knowing loss, it's knowing colonization, it's having to surrender all, level of sovereignty over to the United States. The only resources they have are from the federal government, really.
Right.
And there was a quote in here of a woman who I believe she was Navajo, and her name means many children. And because she was sterilized, it's no longer true to her own name. She had her own identity ripped from her. And that's what's happening to tons of these women. But even within just, the Navajo Nation, having children is so significant, and being able to make that decision for yourself, you're able to prepare for what people are going to say to you, what even just that, like the informed consent of, if I were to get sterilized, then and I made that decision, well, I know how to talk to my mom about it, I know how to talk to my doctors about it. But with it happening without your own consent, you're literally getting taken everything from you.
Right. And I mean, I guess that, that's why there's so much importance in maintaining and continuing to share these stories, because we want to prevent these things from continuing to happen. And, or at least, I mean, I know that obviously with things like Adriana Smith, that's so recent, but we want to try to, at least there's awareness about it, and we're trying to continue these discussions. And I mean, even looking at today, what are early warning signs that personal autonomy is being restricted or redefined?
This all really kind of brings me back to, I think this was in 2021 when Roe v. Wade got reversed. And that was really whenever I was like, hey guys, we should start paying attention to this. But now I think it's politicians making sweeping generalizations over a specific group of people. Because no two individuals, even if they are in the same group, are the same. I think we should all be a little careful about the carceral system and how much power they have over the individuals in jail. Because these people have no autonomy when they are imprisoned. And by extension of that, what's going on to people in detention centers. I know that every time something like this happens, people talk about the Handmaid's Tale and they're like, guys, it's turning into the Handmaid's Tale. And unfortunately, Margaret Atwood, she's a very good author, but I'm just like, some people don't know that a lot of what she wrote about actually happened. People have been through these things already. And as you mentioned, history is very cyclical. These things happen over and over again, just with different circumstances and different things going on. So I think people who have read this book should be wary of anything that tries to demean women or reduce their humanity into simply being incubators. So there's a lot of things that you should keep an eye out for.
Kind of building off of that, do you think it's important then to keep people from, or to allow people to keep accessing these stories? I think it's important that, on my perspective, especially, in my book club, we're talking about banned and challenged books. So people are
Mhm.
actively across the nation trying to restrict The Handmaid's Tale from being accessed in class. Do you think that stories like The Handmaid's Tale, even though they're dystopian, fictional, however we mentioned based in true events, do you think that these stories are still very important to keep in the conversation because of what you've written about in your article?
Yeah, I think all banned books are important. I think it's important to have that foresight to challenge and critique a little bit and wonder, well, why is this book banned? One of the banned books that I saw was Junie B. Jones because, she has like a poor attitude or something like that. And it's just like, okay, but why? I think when you read banned books or you look into the material that is being censored, and you keep an open mind, you start to wonder why these resources are being censored in the first place. And unfortunately, with The Handmaid's Tale, I think it's definitely because of what it speaks about with women's reproductive freedoms, and also the fact that it parallels so many things that's happened in history. I think another one of the banned books that people talk about a lot are To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. And that has a lot to do with what happened to Black people living in the South during the 20th century as well. So, a lot of these books parallel things going on currently, whether it's Black history, women's history, queer history. I think it's very important to be able to keep yourself educated on what's going on and be able to critique why these things were censored in the first place.
Oh, totally. And it's interesting you mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird because that was our read for February. And
Mhm,
I was really, really lucky to be able to speak with an English teacher who's taught that book in schools before, kind of about if the story is still important. A lot of people on
mhm,
both sides of the spectrum think, okay, this book is a little bit outdated. It's not really reflecting history in a way that's appropriate for people. There's other books that are better. And, she agreed in a lot of ways, kind of about, okay, not that this book should be banned. She was not in support of that at all, but they ended up
mhm,
choosing a different book about the Black experience that was in the incarceration system that was written by a Black man himself. And
mhm,
they did that because it's important to understand who is the person presenting these stories, what are the motivations, and to do it in a way that's nuanced, in a way that's sensitive, that's not going to re-harm people, while also
mhm,
making sure that, okay, there's going to be hard conversations in life. We have to be prepared for hard things. And I think with stories like The Handmaid's Tale, it's been challenged on the left because things like the ceremony are considered traumatic for people. And it definitely
mhm,
is a traumatic situation, especially if you're someone who's gone through sexual abuse. I mean, kind of alluding to what you said, that's exactly why it's important for these stories to remain in the conversation, not to re-traumatize people, but to remind, the community, to remind readers that these things are real. These are based on real events and their real
mhm,
experiences. And I'll tie it back as well to an interview I did in January with Patricia McCormick, the author of Sold. I loved what she said because she talked about how books, they're a private place. They're a place where you can read things, you can read about experiences, and you can experience that one-on-one. You're not doing it on the internet. You're not doing this, in front of a classroom. You get to read
mhm,
something, you get to really understand that and understand what's happened to you. And I think women who have, lost their autonomy, women that are not able to access the healthcare that they need to, the reproductive healthcare that they need to, reading these books validates their experiences and also keeps
mhm,
them in conversation. So while I think, The Handmaid's Tale is probably the very typical example to get brought up when we talk about women's autonomy being revoked, and we should probably be talking more about the real life examples that have happened, like the ones that we're discussing today, it's still so important to have these types of stories in for people to even just enter the conversation and begin to
mhm.
understand it.
I definitely agree. And I think when you were talking about certain things in the book that could trigger people who have experienced sexual trauma and things like that, that's why I really love trigger warnings and people who give content warnings about things, because people deserve to be able to make that informed decision for themselves. This is, autonomy all over again,
Yeah,
and make that decision for themselves whether they want to read this book or if they would prefer to choose something else. People being able to make that decision for themselves. Like, I know myself that whenever I'm feeling sad, I'm not going to put on a very sad movie because it's going to make me cry.
right.
So, it's knowing yourself and knowing yourself well enough to be able to make that decision and not have, say, the government who is banning these books make that decision for you. And that's really what this all boils down to, is not having someone make decisions about you for you.
Right. Before all of my, because I do the interviews and I do a solo episode kind of talking about
Hmm.
the book before as well. And before each episode, I do give a trigger warning, because there's such heavy themes that we talk about. And sometimes it's even, I think, just to prep myself. Like the way I do it is I do like a small activity. So I make bouquets of flowers, or I'll do my makeup, or I'll pack for something. And it's to keep my hands busy because otherwise these topics and these themes are so heavy because of how
Hmm.
much they really resonate in real life. Even if it's not my experience, obviously not being a person of color, but I can see it in experiences of people I care about, or there's
Hmm.
elements of experiences, especially with things like The Handmaid's Tale, that have applied to me and other people
Hmm.
I know. And so it's so important when you're having these conversations to do it in a way that's appropriate, in a way that's sensitive, in a way that's considerate, while not shying away from the topic. Not, and that's not
Hmm.
going to be perfect every time, but I think the effort to do it and to center it is really, really what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that nobody was ever hurt from being too empathetic, and nobody was ever harmed from having too much information or too much knowledge. Yeah, if people going ahead and doing this effort, nobody expects someone to be perfect whenever they're going about educating themselves or unlearning biases. It's simply the fact that you are making that conscious decision to re-educate yourself on something that perhaps you believed your whole life. I think that should be something that is very welcome and almost applauded.
Oh, definitely, totally with you. And I love that. I love that. Nobody was ever hurt by having too much empathy or knowing too much information. I think it's so true. I think right now we're in like a kindness, empathy shortage. Everything right now is pretty crazy and arguably pretty bad. And I think people are just kind of trying to protect themselves, and that's all we can do. But I think we have to remember there's a ripple effect to everything. And if we can't trust these, whether it's the medical institution, the government, the legal system, if we can't trust them to protect us, which I would argue we can't, we have to really look out for each other. We have to hear each other and
Mhm.
listen to the needs of the people that are struggling. And everybody's struggling to an element, but there's always going to be different aspects and an inequity with that. And we really have to as a society focus in on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
How would you respond to the idea that this couldn't happen again?
Oh, yikes. I don't think that those are words that any historian believes.
Yeah.
Another paper that I wrote when I was in grad school was about a program during World War II where Mexican men were hired to come and work in agriculture and railroads in the United States. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because whenever these men would cross from Mexico into the United States, they would have to be inspected. And a lot of the times they would have to get physically naked in front of hundreds of other men and be, examined by doctors. And they were just like ushered through. Many of these men mentioned being examined like cattle, and a lot of them were sprayed with DEET and other pesticides to prevent them from bringing in lice. And this is something that happened in the 1940s, and it's something that unfortunately did. Inspire Adolf Hitler that happened during World War II. But
Yeah.
even then, what happened to those Mexican men happened again in the 1910s when Mexican people were being hired to work in the United States. So it happened in the 2010s, it happened in the 1940s, and it happened again during COVID in 2020. These people, mostly immigrants, were being having these medical systems weaponized against them. So I think I really just never believe people who say this can never happen again because I think especially living in a post-COVID world in general, we never thought that, an epidemic would happen that would shut down so much of our lives, and yet that happened again. It wasn't just influenza in the 1910s. It happened again in the 2020s. And so I just think that If we say it'll never happen again, I really hope it's true. I really hope that a lot of these things don't happen again, but that's why we need to be very cautious and very aware of what led to these things happening in the first place so that we don't let things happen again.
Well, I think that's beautifully said. And what responsibility do we have just as a society, not even just as historians, which I think have such a higher threshold of a responsibility in a ways, or not even responsibility, but just by the nature of the role, it's kind of
Mhm.
a duty in a way to preserve and share these stories. How can we as a community continue to support each other?
I love community when people support each other. This is something that I have been challenging myself to do more. I think, again, post-COVID, with all of us being, especially younger people, being very attached to social media and stuff going on our phones, we have not focused very much on connecting with our neighbors and connecting with our friends and doing things offline. And I think that's definitely something that we should all be trying to do more of. Being able to talk to another person. I remember being in the grocery store and having my headphones on and hoping nobody talked to me. But a lot of the time, people just want human connection. They just want to someone else to acknowledge that they are alive, that we're having a good day. Someone talks about the weather. Just be open to having connections with other people. Be patient. Sometimes being in community means being inconvenient whenever someone in community is a little too human. Not everything is going to be perfect, but I think putting in that effort to connect with other people in person, seeing what kind of needs there are in your community. So, when the government shutdown happened and SNAP lost a lot of funding, people got together and they handed out food to their neighbors and they donated extra cans of food and things like that. So, being aware of what is needed in your community, being open to this communication. Yeah, I think definitely staying away from everything going on online. I know it can be super, super overwhelming. I don't think human beings were ever meant to have this much stimulus constantly. I think whenever it gets too overwhelming and you want to shut down and you want to doom scroll, do the best that you can to take care of yourself and connect with people outside.
Definitely. I'm totally with you. Like I said, I think right now there's so much craziness happening. And I think to your point, being online really perpetuates this narrative. And, we have access to everything we could ever want to know just at the touch of our fingertips. And in some ways, that's great. And I think it's caused a lot of amazing progress to happen. And I think a lot of overall empathy. But I think sometimes it's overwhelming and causes people to isolate. And I think that reminder of just staying invested in your community, even if it means being inconvenient, is probably, I would agree with you, is one of the most important things we can do right now in order to take care of each other. Going back to your work and this article in itself, what do you hope people recognize or question differently after engaging with your work? What message would you like people to take away?
Yeah, I overall became a historian because I don't think history should be gatekept. I don't think you need to be able to go to a college class to be able to learn history. I think there is something about history that is interesting to everyone, whether that's, people of color or video games or pop culture. There's just something there that is interesting. And unfortunately, in the United States, our curriculums has not encouraged people to be curious about history. And so I would encourage people to be curious, to try to find something that you're interested in and look into the history of that. Um, History should always be accessible. And I think people should have the resources to be able to access it. And so that is really what my work boils down to. And that's also why I wrote it the way that I did, is because when I wrote it, I got some feedback that, maybe I should use different phrasing and things like that. But I actually sent it to my husband, who was my boyfriend then, and I had him read it. And I'm like, do you understand this? And he was like, no, actually, this is really complicated. What does this mean? So I rewrote it and made it understandable for him. I just don't think history should be gatekept. I think it should be as easy to understand as possible. So everything that I put out in public, I hope is easily accessible. I hope it's easy to understand. And that's something that I hope to continue to do with the rest of my work.
Well, and I have no doubt that you will. I mean, I think exactly what you said is what's so important. It's so easy in academia to get caught up in the language and making it sound
Mhm.
so sophisticated in this, but at the end of the day, this information needs to be accessible to everybody. That's how I would measure success in that field. I think a lot of people would agree with that. And I think what you did exactly, you accomplished your goal. You got that story out there. It's a timely topic and also a timeless topic. So it's something that will continue to be relevant and continue should continue to be in the conversation. And the language that you use and the accessibility that that brings is so crucial and so important, especially talking about bringing together community and having that generalized understanding of each other. So well done, as I said. Thank you so, so, so much for speaking with us on this. And I'm so excited for the listeners to hear this episode and dive into this article. I will definitely link this at the bottom of the YouTube video so that other people can find it and engage with it as well. People might have different questions, so if they do, I'll be sure to send it your way. But really, Paula, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Jenna. I'm looking forward to this, and I hope that the rest of your followers learn something new.
Okay, everybody. I think this was a really good episode. So thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for following along. And thank you to Paula again for being a part of it. When we talk about the Handmaid's Tale, we talk about the ceremony, women being forced to give birth. But I think it's important to remember that the other side of this is very real, very recent, not so far in the past, and we have to keep these stories centered in order to prevent it from happening again. As Paula said, have empathy, look out for each other. Having too much information never will really hurt. Keep engaging with the banned book club. We have to keep reading like freedom depends on it because if you didn't get it from this conversation, it definitely does. So take care, and I'll see you at the next one where we're reading The Kite Runner.